think about what are the barriers to entry to the democratic process and how can we bring them down. We often think of that in terms of what are the barriers to running for office, what are the barriers in terms of organizing and getting people involved. And I think the barriers to what it is to actually just participate as a citizen and vote are huge and varied. There are probably dozens of areas that really need improvement. The biggest for me would be making sure we have clarity about who's able to vote, and really making sure we are allowing every citizen who should be eligible to vote, regardless of whether they have access to a certain kind of ID, or making sure that the polling hours work for people. I mean, there's a lot in every state we've really gone back to challenging people's right to vote in ways that we hadn't seen in this country for a while. There are also issues regarding the integrity of the voting system. We have a very complicated voting system with different kinds of machines and systems across different states and counties, and there's a lot of real questions about cybersecurity in relation to those machines. So those are a real concern too. But making sure everybody's able to vote, that has to be the biggest one. There are people who won't be able to vote. A number of states have enacted requirements that you have a certain kind of identification to vote. That's unnecessary, but states have done that, and they've done it because they know that the people who don't have who don't have a driver's license, for example, are more likely to be minority. They're more likely to be younger. They're more likely to be Democratic voters. So it's done with a real reason. Some of those states have also made it very hard to get a form of identification that's not a driver's license. So people who, not everybody can find their birth certificate, for example. So it's very hard to get an identification in some states. And then in other states, they've really limited the number of places you can vote or the hours you can vote. And then other states, for example, have aggressively what's called purged their rolls, which means they've taken a lot of people off the voting lists, maybe just because they hadn't voted it in the past couple times. And we know there are probably a lot of people who are going to be motivated to vote in this election who maybe didn't vote in the past, but will find that they've been taken off the list. So we have a lot of barriers to voting in this country. It's not a right. It's not a right guaranteed by our Constitution, and we have a lot of states that have really tried to limit it in very serious ways. Our American politics right now is very sharply matched along racial and regional and even age lines, so that it's very easy if you're a Republican, and this really is a one-party vice. If you're a Republican, to say, if I can prevent African Americans from voting, if I can prevent younger people from voting, we will have a political advantage. And that's been going on for a number of years now. And you can know that just because things are so sharply aligned, in a way that they tend to be in European countries. But our parties used to be a little more mixed up for some time. They're not mixed up anymore. It's very significant to me that these votes, whether it's Brexit in the UK or Trump support here in the US, we think that it has something to do with economic anxiety, and it probably does have something to do with people's feelings about the economy, but it's very heavily weighted by people who are retired, supporting Brexit or supporting Trump. If you took retirees out of the system, if you counted the votes only of people under 65, Brexit would have failed massively, and Trump would have very, very little support. It really is weighted heavily by that older group, and that's just a reality. I mean, you're not going to take people over 65 off the voting rolls, and you shouldn't. But I think it gives you a really interesting perspective on how these choices play out. We don't have nationwide referenda in the way that some European countries do. And I think, but I think we see the same phenomenon in our states that you see in other countries. That it's not a great way to make policy. A state like California, which has initiative and referenda, had kind of tied itself in knots for decades. Very hard to get a budget settled. Very hard to make progress because of a lot of things they'd passed by initiative. And I think we see that. In other countries too. Often an initiative it just becomes a vote on the favorability of the government rather than the actual policy question. I think that's what you saw in Colombia, for example. So it's
it is not the best way to make policy. And I think what we're learning is that you need elected officials who are willing to engage in deliberation and choices about public policy, and not assume that the voters can get that deep into policy themselves.